Okay, morning everyone. Hello. Welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19, Prepare Your Supply Chain for the Restart. Thank you for joining us. Our session today will be about 30 to 45 minutes, and this webinar is being recorded. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself and Ashray. My name is Chris Clapham, and I am a principal at Efficio. I have 10 years experience working in procurement and head up our logistics community, supporting our projects and clients whenever we are addressing logistics across multiple industries. Over the last few weeks, I've been supporting some of our clients to manage their logistics in these challenging times, and I look forward to sharing my experiences and views with you today.
Hello all, I'm Asher Lausi. I'm a senior manager here at Efficio. I have about 9 years of experience in procurement and supply chain, and also lead the supply chain strategy community here within our supply chain community at Efficio. Within supply chain, my focus has been on change management, design and deployment of supply chain strategy, as well as supply chain network design.
Thank you, Ashray. And just very quickly, for those who aren't familiar with Efficio, we are the world's leading dedicated procurement consultancy with over 450 procurement and supply chain experts across offices in Europe, America, and the Middle East. We work across a range of industries from financial services to manufacturing, utilities, and infrastructure. And we help our clients to optimize their third-party expenditure through strategic sourcing and supply chain interventions. So that is just to put in brief context who we are. Ashray, can you please take us through the agenda for today's session?
Sure. So we're framing today's conversation around the typical phases of a crisis, right? So we'll start off with the immediate crisis where companies will focus on protecting profitability and cash. We'll then move into the recovery phase where the focus of the companies will be to restart operations as governments across the world ease restrictions. And then we'll finally talk about the new normal, where the focus of the companies will be to synchronize with the new BAU. In all these phases, supply chain has a big role to play to maximize value for the company. Today, we'll start by talking about the immediate impact of COVID on logistics services, and also talk about potential mitigations to consider. We'll then move on to how you can utilize the lessons learned from the crisis to future-proof and build resilience in your supply chain for the medium to long term, as well as discussing what you need to consider to determine your business's new normal and get an advantage over your competition. At the end, we'll also have a Q&A session, and you can submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will collect them and address them at the end of the session. So let's start by looking at what's happening in the immediate crisis phase. Chris, what are the immediate impacts that you have been seeing in logistics?
Thank you, Ashray. Well, logistics services have been particularly impacted by COVID-19 and the restrictions that have been put in place across countries. Starting with air freight, typically around half of air freight air cargo globally would be transported in the belly hold of passenger flights. And for transatlantic routes, this would typically be normally around 80% of the cargo. Given the significant schedule reductions and grounding of many passenger fleets, a significant capacity within the market has been taken away as soon as these restrictions started to come in place. On top of this reduction in market capacity, there's also been a significant surge in demand for air freight on some key lanes, mainly driven by the urgent need for medical supplies and PPE, for example, out of Asia. This has resulted in reduced cargo availability, extended lead times, and also significant price increases. As an example, we've seen that from Shanghai to Europe, prices are now at over 3 times higher than where they were at the beginning of March. We have seen recently, though, the passenger airlines are utilizing some of the passenger planes for freight purposes to try and plug some of that shortage of capacity in the market in the short term.
Yeah, I keep reading about the impact of air freight in the media. There has been a lot of coverage about the airlines. What about the impact on sea freight?
So sea freight has also seen a significant reduction in global demand as factories have closed and global trade has reduced. Due to the reduced demand, carriers have reacted by implementing a number of blank sailings, so cancelling ships, and to basically reduce the available capacity within the market and to also stop market rates from crashing. With the closure of factories back in January in Asia, what also happened is a large number of shipments at that time didn't leave Asia And so therefore what's happened is the ports in Asia became quite congested with empty containers earlier this month. And in turn, this created a shortage and imbalance of containers in Europe and North America. This shortage of containers has caused prices out of Europe to Asia, now more recently, to increase over the past month. But we have seen some falling prices in the other direction, so from Asia to Europe and also to North America more recently.
Well, that's definitely positive news for some of our clients. I imagine, however, that road freight has been impacted differently, right? Because of the way different industries work. How do you see the impact on road freight?
Yeah, so road freight has also been impacted by large reductions in demand and volume across a number of industries, but particularly hard from certain industries such as retail, fashion. Over the last months, we've seen also congestion and delays at border crossings with increased controls and measures being put in place. But these seem to have generally eased off more recently. There've also been some challenges around availability of drivers, especially to travel into certain high risk and hotspot areas of the virus over the past months. But again, these seem to have eased off as challenges to clients more recently. There is a surplus capacity generally in the market, with a number of transport fleets currently parked up or being underutilized. And also on top of this, obviously, we've seen a significant reduction in the oil prices recently. So, that has reduced the operating costs for a lot of the transport operators. However, a lot of this cost benefit is obviously typically being passed on to clients and customers via contract fuel mechanisms in place in the contracts.
That's good to know. And finally, what about courier services?
So we've seen courier services drop their service level guarantees a couple of months ago, as they were also impacted by these tighter border controls and custom delays that I mentioned a minute ago. So they aren't able to guarantee their typical lead times. The networks have also been impacted, in particular, pick-up and drop-off locations. Many of those are shops that have been closed by the country shutdowns. And also they have been quite severely impacted by the air freight challenges that I mentioned earlier as well. We've seen, because of these challenges, also a number of providers introduce additional surcharges during this time. So that is obviously having also a result in terms of cost increases to our clients.
So thanks for the insights. What can businesses do at this time to counter the impact of these issues, in particular around availability and pricing?
Yeah, so I think the key thing firstly to note is that markets are changing very quickly at the moment. There's constantly new services and solutions that are being set up by different providers each day. And also, as I mentioned, some of the pricing is quite volatile. So first and foremost, I think it's really key to have close communication with your key logistics partners, but also the wider market and other players within the market to understand what are the latest solutions and options out there for your needs. But as potential mitigations to consider, it is firstly also important to challenge demands and requirements for any current shipments you may have. Only critical urgent shipments should really be considered for air freight, given the significant price increases we've seen recently. And if there is any kind of flexibility in lead time requirements, that's something really to eke out, because that will allow you to explore alternative options via other transport modes, such as sea freight. For any critical shipments, the obviously key thing is securing that logistics capacity and supply, especially in a crisis environment as we're currently in. These critical shipments are likely to prevent or stop your business operations, resulting in a much more significant commercial impact of the business, or due to health risks if they aren't received, such as is the case for PPE. So securing logistics services for the quickly and getting that capacity is much more important at this time than ensuring you've got the best market price. For those shipments where there is flexibility, that's in terms of, especially into the lead times and requirements, that's where you have the opportunity to explore alternative solutions out there in the market. So as I mentioned a minute ago, important to speak to suppliers, speak to different providers out there to understand what solutions may be out there in place. And some examples of this, for example, are, there are some consolidated sea freight solutions that have been set up more recently by suppliers. And also, actually, I recently heard about a solution via expedited sea freight that actually will help businesses get their goods to arrive quicker than actually certain air freight solutions currently in place. And finally, it is important to review the latest pricing impacts in the markets. We have seen some suppliers implement surcharges and try to increase pricing, and we've seen a number of our clients successfully negotiate these away, especially when there is a longer-term partnership play in place. Equally, with lower oil prices, it is important at this time to ensure any of those cost reductions are being passed on by your suppliers. And optimizing payment terms is another lever that can be considered to ensure cash flow. However, I would stress it is important when looking at payment terms to consider the impact of any of these changes might also have on your supply base. So, these are some of the mitigations that could be considered to deal with some of these challenges in the immediate crisis. But Ashray, if you can take us through in terms of when do you see businesses moving to the recovery phase, and what should they be considering now to prepare for that stage?
So these are unprecedented times, right? So you'll keep hearing that word over the earnings call, but no one knows for certain when the restrictions will be eased. One thing that is certain, however, is that there will be eased over time. We're already seeing a phased easing of restrictions across the world, most recently in Germany, Spain, and France. We see this even more so in China, where as of last month, the capacity is already more than 70%. Additionally, the recovery will also vary by sector, right? So depending on which sector you're in, you might have a quicker recovery, while some sectors might have a slower recovery. But regardless of the sector, it is imperative that businesses start planning now on how they are going to deal with any upcoming challenges and react quickly to relaxing of those restrictions and change in demand practices. Because what's going to happen is once the restrictions are eased, there's going to be a surge for demand for limited capacity, especially in logistics and PPE. This is because that companies that had ramped down production will look to quickly ramp back up operations, which will result in increased prices and bottlenecks across the supply chain. Companies at this point which can fulfill customer demand will go a long way in becoming trusted partners. Additionally, businesses will need to start looking at backward planning on key milestones. Those that have mature sales and planning will have a natural advantage in this regard, as they already have cross-functional forums to set up. As an example, we're currently supporting a French food distributor with a backward planning approach. Schools are a core customer segment, and hence, based on schools reopening phasing, they need to accurately plan and place orders to meet the demand on time and in full. From now on, the winners will be those companies that can move quickly and decisively. And we should utilize the lessons learned from the past few months to ensure that we are better prepared for the recovery and to gain an edge over their competition. Businesses will act now to both, they'll need to act now both internally as well as the broader supply chain to get ahead of the curve. So Chris, what are some of the actions that businesses should be taking?
Well, firstly, starting from an internal perspective, if it is not already the case, the procurement and supply chain functions should be plugged into the company's forecasting processes. As Ashray mentioned earlier, if your business already has a mature S&OP process, then this is likely to already be the case. Although in the current crisis, we would expect more regular reviews than normal. If this is not in place, now is the perfect time to be setting up cross-functional forums which meet at least 2 to 3 times a month to review the latest demand forecast and plan accordingly on how the business will deliver that. The key here is about internally working at pace across functional departments and being prepared to react quickly. As part of the forecasting process, it is also very important to consider the latest lead times, as these may well have changed from previous business as usual, and as mentioned earlier, due to slower transport lead times as well. So it's really important to consider, as Ashray just mentioned, backward planning. For example, if you want to restart your operations in 2 weeks' time, you may actually need to be ordering raw materials today, given the latest supplier and transport lead times, in order to actually begin your operations in those 2 weeks' time. Additionally, businesses need to consider moving away from the traditional ordering signals, such as reorder points, and rely more on replenishing based on forecasts. Forecasting alone won't solve the issues of stockouts during a crisis, so you need to also explore ways to ensure your business can react in an agile way by reducing the order to fulfillment times, as the demand during the recovery phase is going to be very atypical. As the government's announced measures to ease restrictions, one thing that is becoming common is the requirement to source PPE for both customers and employees. We are likely going to be in a situation where all of your competitors and other industries are going to be competing for the same PPE, and hence it's going to be really important to move quickly now to identify your PPE requirements and secure those at reasonable prices in the seller's market.
In addition to PPE, you also need to move quickly to secure capacity for other suppliers, right? Especially for logistics, which I just talked about earlier. Also, you need to have enhanced communication, both upstream and downstream, with your suppliers and customers to build strategic relationships with them by sharing your operational plans. You should at the same time also get feedback on their supply capacity as well as what's available. And from the customers, you need to get feedback on what the actual demand is out there. What this will help you do is you ensure that you're all working towards the same direction from a single version of the truth. Joint planning and collaboration is the way to go right now. This is the time when you need to be completely aligned with your supply base and take care of them as much as possible. This would also be a good time to optimize your payment terms, wherein you don't really have to pay until you're absolutely required to. We have had success in extending payment terms at some of our clients resulting in significant savings. This does not mean by any means that you take a broad stroke and ask for longer payment terms across all your supplier base, right? Because there will invariably be some smaller suppliers which are struggling during this time. For them, you may need to even move to immediate payment terms. This is something that Network Rail has successfully implemented. What this does is that it ensures you get a surety of supply and also takes care of your supply base. At a minimum, you need to be sharing your forecast with them and may even need to share order risk and help them procuring PPE to keep operations up and running, right? We'll also have succeeded in securing discounts from suppliers at some of our clients, especially in chemicals. Again, I'm not really advocating a broad stroke approach, but more of a focus approach where you engage with the suppliers on a strategic level. And lastly, if you haven't already done so, you need to conduct a resiliency diagnostic of your supply chain. What this will help you do is it will help you to determine pain points or risk areas in your supply chain, which you can then develop action plans to help mitigate. This will help you for the full restart of activity. It's very critical that you make sure that your supply chain is as flexible as possible, as there's going to be tremendous volatility in the market when the restart starts. What we just discussed from a restart perspective might be out of the comfort zone from most of the traditional procurement and supply chain practitioners, and hence senior leadership needs to step in to lead the change. You might even need to call in external support. One thing to note here, however, is that after the restart, the demand patterns and supplier behaviors will have changed irreversibly, leading us to a new normal.
Absolutely, Ashray. The world coming out of this pandemic is going to look very different than the world going into it. As you mentioned, there are going to be everlasting changes which businesses will need to account for. The foremost thing businesses need to do is define their new normal, and this will look different by sector and even individual companies within each sector. A lot of factors will go into defining this new normal. What businesses need to keep in mind is to reflect on the lessons learned so far, make their supply chains more resilient, and reassess their supply chain strategy. So let's take each of those things in turn, and let's start from a lessons learned perspective. We've already talked about securing logistics capacity in the earlier sections during the current crisis situation, and that will hold true even whilst defining the new normal. As part of this, we may want to consider adding flexibility into our logistics solutions so as to be able to better handle any future volatility, be that through having multiple vendors or alternative transport solutions to service our supply chain. Cost management is also going to be front and center of all future supply chain strategies, as you want to ensure that you are utilizing the optimum transport solutions and modes based on total cost. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen there are different and new solutions out there now which may offer a more cost-effective solution to your business needs, as well as providing similar or even better service levels. Checking and ensuring suppliers' financial health and viability will be particularly important as we move into the new normal, And having transparency of cost drivers across your supply chain will enable you to manage your costs better and understand also the cost impact of underlying commodity changes to your supply chain. Close controls and audits on invoices will ensure that costs remain in line with expectations and budgets. Lastly, businesses need to ask themselves the question whether their supply chain networks are still optimally set up for the future. They may want to consider changing the amount of nodes or hubs in their supply chain network, as well as where these should be optimally located to make the supply chain more cost efficient and be able to flex to future demand profile changes.
Agreed. In addition to just reflecting on the lessons learned, what I mentioned for the restart also holds true for defining the new normal. So you need to make sure that your supply chain is as resilient as possible. What this could mean is finding a balance between just in time and holding too much inventory. Businesses will also need to start looking at how do we build redundancy, or do we build redundancy across some critical routes or critical suppliers. This could take the form of looking at onshoring or nearshoring. And in some cases, you might even want to look at, do you want to vertically integrate with your suppliers for some critical components? A word of caution, though, when you're looking at vertical integration, is to make sure that you're not overly leveraged. Lastly, as supply chains over the last 3-4 decades have been aggressively outsourced, what we've seen is that supply chains have gotten fatter, resulting in multiple tiers in the supply chain. This causes an inherent risk, wherein a tier 2 or 3 supplier could be providing supplies to multiple of your tier 1 suppliers. If that tier 2 or 3 supplier has some issues, then that causes ripple effects across your supply chain, and it may result in a lot of bottlenecks. Companies need to very quickly gain visibility across the multiple tiers by mapping out the tiers in your supply chain. At the same time, enhanced communication, a track and trace system, and a TMS system will also go a long way in affording visibility across your different tiers. At this point, it becomes very imperative that companies reassess their supply chain strategies.
Absolutely. One of the first things that businesses will need to do whilst reassessing their supply chain strategy is to reevaluate the trade-offs between cost efficiency and resilience, as well as revenue and risk. As Ashray touched upon earlier, a lot of supply chain has been outsourced in the past few decades, and there might now be a case to reverse some of those decisions somewhat, to have a balance of cost efficiency, but to build in more resilience into your supply chain. A similar logic would also apply whilst evaluating revenue and risk. Many of our clients are reevaluating their risk profiles and also considering how new supply chain innovations can be integrated into their supply chain design. A key question businesses need to ask themselves is what kind of balance between these priorities do they want to build for their new supply chain?
Agreed. And in the same vein, one of the other things that businesses will need to start doing is look at their entire product portfolio and segment them across use and variability into an 11 box to figure out what specific set of rules you can apply to each product profile. For example, if you have your high runners or even critical components, you may want to hold more inventory on site or near shore or even onshore. While if there are some products which are more volatile, you might want to move to make to order for them and set clear expectations with your customers for the same. This will also help you determine your new inventory parameters for the new normal, right? So it will help you determine what your safety stock needs to be, what your reorder points need to be. Additionally, digitalization will play a critical role in the definition of the new normal. And more companies should move to using digital dashboards across their organization so that everyone is working on a single version of the truth, as well as the right performance is being measured. More importantly, what this will do is it will weed out different departments having conflicting KPIs and will ensure that everyone is working in the same direction. This goes together with tracking any changes in external spend and monitoring supplier risk. The identification and monitoring of critical suppliers should become a priority, and I cannot stress this enough. Further digitalization of operations systems such as TMS, track and trace, and receipt capture should also be explored at this point.
Thank you, Ashray. All of these are key considerations to improve our supply chains, especially as research institutes are predicting that this might not be the last crisis in our lives. And such events are bound to happen more often. We're also likely to experience additional disruptions to supply chains because of economic and political instability, such as Brexit and also climate change. It is therefore imperative that businesses reflect on the recent lessons learned from the COVID crisis and review their supply chain strategy, ensuring it is more resilient and agile to weather any future crises. So to recap, crises bring challenges, but also opportunities. Those who act rapidly and decisively will thrive and come out of this crisis stronger. So to summarize the key actions you should be considering as a business at this time, firstly, you should be considering start planning for the recovery now to ensure you can react quickly and with agility as restrictions are relaxed. You need to make sure you're working in cross-functional teams to ensure all parts of the business are working in unison and that customer expectations can be managed effectively. Making your supply chain more resilient through building in additional flexibility and backups, as well as having more transparency of the supply chain tiers, and securing capacity for critical items so that your restart isn't delayed and you can service customers ahead of the competition.
Further, you also need to reflect on the lessons learned by securing required supply capacity, looking at cost management, and flexing your distribution network to make sure that it is still fit for purpose. And lastly, you need to evaluate your supply chain strategy by looking at the balance of parameters such as risk, revenue, efficiency, and cost, as well as conduct a product segmentation of your product portfolio and a digitalization assessment. All of these points will help you define your new normal. So we're now going to start answering questions that you have submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit the questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. All right, so let's look at some questions. All right, just give me one moment. So one of the questions here, Chris, is we currently don't have our road freight prices linked to a fuel index with our suppliers. What are my options to ensure I can gain some of the benefit of the reducing oil prices?
Yeah, good question. I mean, from our experience, we've seen that generally it is best practice to link pricing to commodity indices where this makes up a significant proportion of the cost base. Through these mechanisms, suppliers do not need to price in the risk of any of those changing commodity prices impacting their margins. And also what we have seen is that suppliers will request price increases as those underlying commodities increase, but when those underlying commodities decrease, suppliers are often quiet. So if you don't have a fuel mechanism in place, I would recommend to discuss and negotiate with the suppliers to pass on some of these cost benefits. We know that fuel costs account for around 25% of a road freight transport operation. And so using this information, along with the change in the fuel prices in your local market, you can create some fact base to begin discussions and negotiate with your suppliers.
Okay. I see one more question, and this is around SNOP, I think. All right, so what suggestions do you have for demand planners struggling to develop forecasts at a time when recent history is skewed and long-term demand might be fundamentally different? I can take that one. So if you have an SNOP process set up, you should essentially meet more frequently. This is something that Chris kind of alluded to as we walked through the webinar. You should have more frequent roll-ups, so maybe even have 2 or 3 a month. So typical, you'd have 1 roll-up a month, but you might want to go to 2 to 3. You may also want to reduce your forecasting horizon. So if you have a horizon of a year or 6 months, you might want to reduce it to 3 months, and again look at it 2 to 3 times a month, right? Your forecasting assumptions at the same time you might want to tighten those, and also make sure that you share them across the board with your suppliers so that everyone's working from the same playbook essentially. There might be a case, even like if you have very critical suppliers, there might be a case of actually including them as part of your SNOP cycle, right? What we've also done, just as a plug here, is that we have actually compiled a very comprehensive supply chain guide, which will go into a lot more detail on what each module of the supply chain you can do for the restart. It's going to be published hopefully sometime later this week. but be on the lookout for that. Hope that answers that question. Let's look at one more. All right, so this one's around PPE, Chris, so maybe you can take that one. We are
Yep.
trying to get PPE for our business, but are getting increasingly frustrated because of the high prices and unreliable suppliers. Do you have any pointers in securing PPE capacity for restart?
Yeah, I can. So we've already seen a significant surge in demand for PPE, as has been broadcast in the media. And as we mentioned earlier, as businesses reopen, we expect a further surge and peak in demand, especially given the steer from governments to mandate the need of PPE for workforces. Similar to mitigating the challenge of limited logistics services availability we discussed earlier, it is key to constantly be researching the market in these current times to identify where there is spare capacity and availability out there, especially given the amount of suppliers that are out there, and also, as we've seen, large differing pricing as well. We've been helping a number of clients source PPE recently and have set up actually a dedicated team internally to constantly research the market to find the latest sources and availability of supply from local, nearshore, as well as low-cost country suppliers. If you want some support in sourcing PPE, feel free to get in contact to us on how we can help you. I've also actually seen just an additional question come around that on the Q&A as well, mentioning around payment terms we've talked about, and many suppliers might be asking for cash payment for PPE, and kind of what would our advice be around that? I think we mentioned earlier in terms of something like PPE is likely to be critical for your operations, and so therefore if providing cash payment is going to mean that you secure that supply and there aren't alternatives out there, then that's definitely something that should be considered. But again, part of looking at the wider market, you can make sure you can see what are the alternative options there. And if obviously you're short of cash at the moment and you need to have some kind of payment term options, maybe there are alternative providers out there.
I see a question around, does your approach account for a plausible W-shaped recovery instead of a V-shaped predicted by most? So this is essentially, if I understand this right, so this is around what if there's a second peak and there's a second wave. So I know I read somewhere that when there was a Spanish flu, it was a 2-year period where there were many multiple false starts. So this could be something which is very similar, right? And Chris, feel free to chime in. So in case of a false restart, this will still hold true, is at least my opinion, because the more you are prepared, you might want to set in place, as we mentioned, the backward plan, right, based on certain milestones. So if you hit a certain number, or if there are certain milestones which are happening around the world, you might want to put some plans in place. So this approach kind of still applies for a W-shaped recovery, or multiple Ws if need be.
Yeah, agree. And I think, part of the things we've mentioned is around building flexibility and resilience into your supply chain. And so that should help you, if we do see a W-shaped recovery, that will help your supply chain be set up and be able to deal with that as well. So a lot of those points we've covered as part of building a new normal are also applicable in this recovery phase, and giving you that flexibility to react in whatever shaped recovery we end up having. I also see one other question here around, what about service sector organizations? Obviously, a lot of what we've covered is, focusing on supply chain of products and so on. But I think a lot of these also, these points still apply. I mean, even if you're in a service sector, PPE, as we've just discussed, is going to be important given the directions and we're being given by governments. And again, it's going to be around flexibility and reacting to changes in customer demand profiles. So I think even though it may not be, well, even though a lot of the types and solutions and key takeaways we've mentioned will be applicable in service organizations as well.
Okay, I see a question here around moving supply base away from China after COVID-19. What can you advise? So at this point, so the advice is going to be pretty generic, right? So each company will have a separate set of scenarios that they need to consider. But one thing for sure is that we're seeing across multiple of our clients that they're reevaluating on, do they need to have a redundant source somewhere which is near shore. So this is where I was talking about the product segmentation bit, right? So if you have high runners or critical components, you might want to have a second source or multiple sources of them. One can be in China, one can be closer home, or wherever it need be. But it would depend on what your business is, how it looks like. So a lot of companies are evaluating that, and there will definitely be some sort of shift. What sort of shift, we don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple other questions still come in, but I think, yeah, in the interest of time, and also we'll look to follow up with you individually on some of those. But I think we'll bring this to a close now. So thank you very much, Ashray, and thank you to all the attendees of today's webinar. We hope you found it really useful and insightful. Once you leave today's webinar, you will be directed to a survey, which we would really appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to complete and provide some feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So finally, just on behalf of Efficio, Ashray, and myself, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.